ultimately, if you look at the big picture of the book, it's a book about isolation, and it's a book about how you bridge that gap from isolation to not isolation. In terms of, you know, you'll do anything to break out of that isolation. There's a chimp in the book, Cindy, who literally jumps from one island to another, sacrificing her infant in the process to avoid isolation. And to me, that's what we can understand about chimpanzees, is that need for a rich social environment, the need for cognitive stimulation, the need for freedom of choice, to be able to choose and do what we want to do. All else is going to be very, very difficult for us to know about chimpanzees, because we can't crawl into their head. We can.
I'm going back now to my original question, which I delayed until I saw whether we would agree on the basics of a concept of curiosity. So, which chimpanzee do you know is the most curious, and which chimpanzee do you know is the least curious, and how did that affect their lives?
So I would posit that chimpanzees are going to be naturally all curious. Where I think that gets affected is when I've worked with sanctuaries, chimpanzee sanctuaries, and chimpanzees that have been deprived of socialization, or deprived of an enriching environment, or deprived of freedom of choice, from, you know, whether being in a pet situation, or a bad zoo or something like that, that they lose that. And they lose it because they lose the ability to interact with their environment, because they've been isolated, because they've you know, gone through these types of really horrendous histories. And that you'll see chimpanzees sitting in a corner rocking, not being curious about anything, losing that drive to do that. That said, I don't know a chimpanzee that hasn't been in that situation that isn't curious about something. We're you know, all chimpanzees are individuals. They have individual preferences, individual likes, individual challenges, individual needs. That they are as individual as humans, and you know, whereas, you know, some humans want to go explore a mountain, other humans are content, you know, looking through, you know, a comic book. But both are exploration and both are curiosity. And I think in the same manner, you've got chimpanzees who are going to be exploratory no matter what, just because it's part of the genetic makeup, and they might just want to be exploring in different ways. So it would be hard to say who is the most curious chimpanzee I've ever known. I know that you know, I do a conservation project in Sierra Leone, and we do it with wild chimpanzees, and that's all monitored through camera traps. And we have one young individual who is very curious about the camera traps. Most of the chimps don't even pay attention to the camera traps. We have one that will look right into it and tap on it and things like that. So, you know, just observationally, he's very curious. But, you know, the others are probably curious too, just curious about other things, and they don't care about the camera trap. I think there's different things that chimpanzees can be curious about by their preferences. I'm not sure there's, you know, levels of curiosity, other than, again, if a chimp has been had a pretty horrible history, are they basically catatonic, and they're not interacting with their environment at all. But I think outside of that, yeah, there would be different facets of curiosity. But I do think all chimpanzees are curious. But it would be hard to gauge, you know, what's more curious versus less curious, because again, I think whereas, you know, I might not be curious to, you know, to climb a mountain. I might be very curious to sail into an ocean and explore that. But there's going to be different things that I'm going to be curious about that others aren't, and different things that others are going to be curious about that I'm not. and different ways to express that curiosity. You know, there's some again are content to look through a book or go to a website and be curious that way. Others want to actually go experience it, but I think both is curiosity, and I'm not sure one shows more curiosity than another. Um, and I think chimpanzees are again just as individualized as humans, and they're going to have various facets of curiosity.
In your book, The Song of the Ape, you are a meth, methodical, rational anthropologist. You observe with some objectivity and then form hypotheses from those observations that make rational sense. You are guided by a sense that you want to improve the care of the species. Um, but can a chimpanzee be known fully through science and rationality? As a child, you say you were fascinated with animals and with apes in particular. As an adult, you say in your book that you, quote, used to love to watch chimpanzees form relationships. That's your phrase, love to watch. You use words in your book like intrigued, wondered, amazement. As a keeper, you had the freedom to observe the way you wanted, not the way primatology prescribed and structured. You observed with your word wonder before you formulated theories, with the clarity of a mind that's uncluttered by too many preconceptions. Those words, fascinated, intrigued, wondered, amazed, suggest a faculty of mind different from a rational detachment. So, my question is, can a person know more about chimpanzees than a rational scientific ability can understand? And if so, what would that other way of knowing be?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. I mean, the whole scope of that book was to write a book from the perspective of someone that was not a big scientist, not a big primatologist, not someone who is going to cite Wrangham 1980 as they're like looking at this group of chimpanzees and put it into models. Literally, just someone who is working with chimpanzees every day that is fascinated by chimpanzees in the same way by working with them. Um, but at the same time, knowing that most of what is out there in kind of the public sphere of chimpanzees, um, you know, separate from the academic side, is very sensationalist and almost very circusy, even for those that try to come at it as the welfare of the chimpanzee is very anthropomorphic and um, doesn't really allow you to get to know a chimpanzee because you're constantly comparing the chimpanzee with humans. I throw a lot of things in with that. I throw the language trained apes in with that. Let's and Coco's obviously was a gorilla, not a chimpanzee, but to me, Coco doesn't tell us anything about gorillas, and Kanzi doesn't tell us anything about bonobos, and Washu doesn't tell us anything about chimpanzees. What they tell us about is how human we can try and make these individuals instead of getting to know the individuals themselves. At the same time, in the academic sphere, is what we know about chimpanzees as far as the wild comes from a very limited amount of wild sites, and you know chimpanzees are incredibly complex and act very individualized and can act in very different ways. And so just because it's adhering to a model that is working in Gombe or the Mahale Mountains doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in Sierra Leone or at a tourist attraction in Florida. that chimpanzees are going to act as individuals. And the whole concept of the book was to see what can I identify with these chimpanzees, and how can I get to know them, and because I'm not getting to know them through reading, the academic literature, other than knowing, the basics, and I'm certainly not getting to know them by watching the National Geographic specials. How do I actually get to know these individuals, and kind of that, looking at kind of the empirical stuff of what I was seeing and trying to analyze it that way is what I got out of it. I should mention that the book Song of the Ape managed to please absolutely no one. The academic side didn't like it, and the Coco the gorilla side didn't like it. And so, but maybe that small niche in there that did is who I was speaking to anyway. So
Well, as a non-scientist myself, who's read a certain amount of this literature, um, I think the book was very successful. I think it was written exactly how it should be written, and I think it's very accessible for a reader, a particular reader without uh, the preconceptions that come with a discipline like primatology. And I read your book years ago, and I reread it um, recently so that I could talk to you. And this, I thought the style and the narrative was perfect in the book, in making the chimpanzees accessible to a reader. I don't feel that reading scientific studies, primatology studies, make chimpanzees accessible to me in the way your book did. Um, to me, um, it should touch a large audience, and I think it's a real contribution. Um, um, so, and the style and the narrative of the book and the basis is part of the basis of my question, because I felt that the book helped me make a connection of understanding, um, that what I think of as more rational and discursive approach wouldn't. And that was kind of the basis of my question. That is, um, could we know more about chimpanzees? Could we understand them better if uh, we could set aside this kind of rational consciousness? One final question. Um, what don't you think we know about the consciousness of chimpanzees, and what might we never know?
there are it's kind of like we're confined by our own brain to understand the world in terms of, a very human centric way of doing things, just like the way we understand the world in terms of space and time that conforms to our human brain. Whereas we might perceive something as, an object unto itself, a different being might see it as components of that object. I think what is impossible for us to know about a chimpanzee is to be able to actually know what it feels like to think and be and have the consciousness of a chimpanzee. I think that, again, part of the book was to see where can we relate, what can we what can we empathize with, what do we share, and to me the things that we share, um, is the need for socialization, the need to communicate with each other, the need for each other, the need for, to be in a social group, and that's contrasted in the book with isolation and what isolation can do to you. And ultimately, if you look at the big picture of the book, it's a book about isolation, and it's a book about how you bridge that gap from isolation to not isolation. In terms of, you'll do anything to break out of that isolation. There's a chimp in the book, Cindy, who literally jumps from one island to another, sacrificing her infant in the process to avoid isolation. And to me, that's what we can understand about chimpanzees, is that need for a rich social environment, the need for cognitive stimulation, the need for freedom of choice, to be able to choose and do what we want to do. All else is going to be very, very difficult for us to know about chimpanzees, because we can't crawl into their head. We can look at, activity budgets and feeding ecologies and what they do and the choices they do and what their relationships are and things like that. What we can't do is crawl into a chimpanzee's head and be able to experience the world as a chimpanzee. We can ruminate about that and try and figure out what it must be like, but it's impossible to do. All we can do is look at the things that we share with chimpanzees and try to apply our own experiences and match the experience with chimpanzees and see how we would feel in that situation. Is at what point would humans get to the point where they would jump from one island to another and sacrifice a child to be able to be with the group they want to be with? What is it about a chimpanzee that drives them to do that? Because chimpanzees do a lot of behaviors that we would never ever do, and so what drives them to do that? And that's something that we can look at ecological models to try and predict those things, but it's, without crawling into a chimpanzee's head, I think that would be unknowable.
Thank you, Andrew, for writing this book, because I treasure my copy. I don't know if you can see the little markers I've got here, the underlining. I've done that. I want to thank you for writing that book, and I really felt that that book helped me get in closer to the lives of apes than most of what else I've read.
Yeah, I'm really glad you liked it. I wrote it just for that reason, just because I wanted to express how these individuals were fascinating me, and I wanted to do it in a way that wasn't a you know very elite science book, and also wanted to do it that wasn't a kind of wacky not science book. I wanted to just kind of share my experiences. So I'm really glad you liked it.